In the land where war means peace, freedom means slavery, Ontario schools hold book burning ceremony in the name of reconciliation. This from the Post Millennial on Ontario School Board held a symbolic book burning to advocate reconciliation and support for indigenous peoples. The board now regrets the move. One would have thought that perhaps someone on the board would have had foresight prior to holding a book burning ceremony. Now, I think it's interesting that they did it in support of indigenous peoples. If you remember last week on FW News, we talked about the stunning and brave college professor from Canada who stopped using capital letters in support of indigenous people. She will only use capital letters in support of indigenous people. So let's see what kind of lunacy happened here. An Ontario Francophone, I don't know what that is, school board held a symbolic book burning to advocate reconciliation and support for Indigenous peoples. They now regret the move, which received sharp condemnation. Thank God for that. Radio Canada first reported the flame purification ceremony by the council scholar, I don't know, this is like French, who burned some 30 books for educational purposes. The board, which oversees elementary and secondary schools in southwestern Ontario, says the books' ashes were then used as fertilizer to plant a tree. You know, there was I don't know if people remember this. So I am obsessed with the Twilight Zone. I have seen like every, and I'm talking like the old school Twilight Zone, like the one from like the 60s. I think it was the 60s. I have seen every episode of like the old school black and white Twilight Zone. I think it's great. Now, there has been a very recent reboot of the Twilight Zone, and it sucks. It's so woke. It's so bad. It's such a disappointment. But what a lot of people don't remember is in the 90s, they also did a reboot of the Twilight Zone. This is like a lesser known thing, but the very first episode in the 90s version of like the Twilight Zone reboot is basically a story about parents sending their unruly children off to re-education camp where they get made into fertilizer to plant trees in the front yard. So the last image in this episode of the Twilight Zone, this disturbed me so much. This is why I remember it. Like the last image is these parents they've captured their young troublemaking child. They've sent them off to re-education reform school. And the very last scene is them planting a nice tree of remembrance for their troublemaking son in the front yard using fertilizer that they made from him. I'm not making that up. Doesn't that sound a little familiar? The board, which oversees elementary and secondary schools in southwestern Ontario, says the book's ashes were then used as fertilizer to plant a tree. They literally took this from an episode in the Twilight Zone. Not the good Twilight Zone, but like the first sucky reboot of the Twilight Zone. We bury the ashes of racism, discrimination, and stereotypes in the hope that we will grow up in an inclusive country where we can live in prosperity and security, according to a video about the book burning. More than 4,700 across 30 schools have been destroyed or in the process of being recycled, Radio Canada reported. Lynn Causette, the board spokesperson, told the National Post that they formed a committee with input from many Aboriginal knowledge keepers and elders. They participated and were consulted at various stages, from the conceptualization to the evaluation of books to the tree planting initiative. So they had a whole flipping committee about a literal book burning. And no one spoke up and said, maybe this is a bad idea. Symbolically, some books were used as fertilizer, wrote Causette in an email. The project, entitled, I am not going to pronounce that, Give Back to the Earth, was intended to make a gesture of openness and reconciliation. Oh, shoot. Hang on. It was intended to make a gesture of openness and reconciliation by replacing books in libraries that had been outdated content and carried negative stereotypes about First Nations and other indigenous people. The board constantly updates its school libraries, she said, with newer editions having positive and inclusive messaging about the diverse communities within our schools. So they are literally memory holing books. They formed a committee to literally memory hole books, and then they use those books as fertilizer to plant trees so that they could replace those books with more acceptable books with the right language that they all want to include in their updated library. We regret that we did not intervene to ensure a more appropriate plan for the commemorative ceremony and that it was offensive to some members of the community. Dude, like, okay, I'm sorry, but how does this happen with a committee of people? How do you literally get a committee of people in a room and you say, guys, I know what we're gonna do. I've got it. I've got the plan. We're gonna hold a symbolic book burning in which we're gonna burn all the books with all the language that we don't like, and then use those ashes as fertilizer to plant trees. Who's on board? Who thinks this is a great idea? And no one speaks up and says, no, this is not a good idea. This is bad. This is a bad idea. This is not thought through. This is going to backfire in our faces. How does that happen? It happens when you infuse wokeness into every part of your organization, making it impossible to speak up against groupthink, because if you speak up against groupthink, that means that you are a racist. That's how this happens. When you literally ban and outlaw dissent as part of your organizational practice, you end up doing literal book burnings. This is what happens because no one speaks up and says, this is a bad idea. We need to do something else instead. Asked about the book burning, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau says it's not up to Indigenous people. It's not up to non-Indigenous people to tell Indigenous people how they should feel or act to advance reconciliation. Justin Trudeau just came out in favor of book burning because racism. On a personal level, I would never agree to the burning of books. But if they want to burn books, that's their business. That's their business. It would be racist to tell them otherwise. Let's see. This guy, who's a conservative leader, says, we don't burn books. He added, we expose ourselves to history. We explain it. We demonstrate how society has evolved or must evolve. Aaron chimed in, reconciliation is important for all Canadians. And we have to have a system that does not discriminate. A conservative government is committed to reconciliation, blah, 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 blah. Yep, that's about it on that. They had a book burning. And no one thought to speak up prior to the book burning to say, this is a bad idea. Jared says, I legit have questions for you about New Hampshire. A lot happening, but New Hampshire is looking like a place I will be moving. Yay, Jared. I'm looking forward to chatting with you on Locals this Tuesday. Go support her Locals. Yeah, guys, what Jared is talking about is for supporters in my Locals on every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. We do Zoom calls where you can come and chat with me and other members of the community. We also do them on Thursday at noon Eastern time. Jared, another thing you might want to do is reach out to the Free State Project. And we can talk about this in Locals on Tuesday. But if you reach out to the Free State Project, they're going to be able to help you and give you all sorts of information and help with moving to New Hampshire. I love living in New Hampshire. I think New Hampshire's great. We were briefly considering moving to Florida. And then I started hanging out much more with the libertarians in New Hampshire, to be honest. And so I have no plans to leave. I think New Hampshire is great. I'm happy to answer any questions about it. And fun fact, we are the only state in New England that is not succumbing to Biden's ridiculous mandates, which we're going to be talking about in a second.